Good morning, and a peaceful Lord's Day to all this morning. How you like the slide? Guess what I forgot this morning? Well, today's lesson is actually on the transfiguration, which you will find in Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 13. So that's where we're going to be. That's our text this morning. And we're out of AA batteries. This is why I'm using this microphone too. The Mount of Transfiguration. This is coming down to the end of Jesus' time here on earth when this moment occurs in time. It's important, it's significant, and it's something we should hold on to and understand, maybe on a deeper level than we ever have before. But let me read what is told to us in Matthew 17. And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah, talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And a voice from the cloud said this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Rise and have no fear." And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. And as they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus commanded them, "Tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead." And the disciples asked him, "Then why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come?" And he answered, "Elijah has come, and he will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. But do you get the picture? Jesus has taken this handful of men with him, his closest disciples. He's gone up to a mountaintop with them. And while they are there, Jesus is transfigured or transformed right before their very eyes. They're seeing him in a whole new light, quite literally. It says his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. So we see Jesus is transfigured, as it says. He's changed right before their very eyes. And then they see both Moses and Elijah speaking with Jesus. One of the things that's always fascinated me about this is, how did they know? How did they know one was Moses and the other was Elijah? Unless it was revealed to them by the Spirit. It's not like they had photographs. It's not like there was a lot of great art back in their time, especially for the Jews, because that would have been an image of something they shouldn't have done. But it is clear to them that they are seeing Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. They're seeing the Son of God, and they're seeing the giver of the law, and they're seeing one of the great prophets to the Jews that God spoke through. And then you go down to verse 5, it says, "While still speaking, when behold, the bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, 'This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him.'" You know, last week we really looked at the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And at the end of the parable, Jesus says in the parable, he says at the end, even if one comes back from the dead, they're not going to believe. And they were told in the parable, you have Moses and you have the prophets. Listen to them. And if you don't listen to them, you won't even believe if one comes back from the dead. We hear about Moses and the prophets throughout the gospel accounts because God called Moses to deliver his people, and he gave him the law, and he gave that law to the people. And when those people transgressed that law, he sent his prophets to tell them to turn around, to repent, and come back and walk according to God's will. They were always warned before God acted. He gave them plenty of time. They had the law, they disobeyed the law. He sent the prophets to turn them around, to obey the law and do the will of God, and yet they still went off and did whatever it is they wanted to do, and therefore they were punished for that. Peter, James, and John were incredibly privileged to be where they were that night with Jesus because they saw and they heard the culmination of everything. Because, see, the Son of God, he was there. Moses, the giver of the law, was there. Elijah, one of the great prophets of God, was there. And Peter, James, and John were excited to be there, scared to be there. And Peter says, let me make 3 tabernacles, one for each of you. And while he's still talking, God says, this is my Son. Listen to him. This is the significant statement that occurs at the Mount of Transfiguration. See, the Jews were supposed to obey the law that God gave to Moses and Moses gave to them. They were supposed to respond to prophets when they were sent, when they were not obeying that law. They were to listen. Listen to Moses. Listen to the prophets. But God proclaims in this moment to these 3 witnesses, this is my Son in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. What's going on here? He's saying, I've spoken to you through Moses. I've spoken to you through the prophets. I speak to you finally and for the last time through my Son, Jesus the Christ. Listen to him. I get a visual of, you get all these, we don't have a lot of opinions coming at us all the time in the world, do we? We don't have all kinds of people saying, I've got the right way, you don't, and on it goes, and nobody can get along. And God is proclaiming in this moment, he's like, I know you've heard what Moses had to say because I told him to tell you that. You've heard what the prophets have had to say because I told them to tell you that. But now, listen to Jesus. Listen to him. You and I have proclaimed we are disciples of Jesus the Christ. Are we listening to him? Are we really listening to him? Or are we trying to bring back part of the law and go by that? People who claim to be Christians and disciples of Christ are doing that. Are we listening when we're told to stop doing the things we're doing? God used the apostles to write letters to tell us to knock it off. And all they were doing was reiterating what Jesus had to say. How are we doing? Are we listening? Are we listening to the Son of God? We don't need to listen to the law. We don't need to listen to the prophets. Jesus was there before them, and God said, listen to him. Listen to him. Well, hadn't they already been listening to him for 3 years? Yeah. But this is a significant moment. This is when God is saying, I spoke to you through Moses. I spoke to you through the prophets. I'm not going to speak to you through them anymore. I am speaking to you for the last time, and we've got to get this. The last time. I'm speaking to you through my Son. Listen to him. Listen to him. We're told this again in a different way in a different place. Did you know that? Turn over to Hebrews chapter 1. This is a letter written to the Jews who had become Christians, who had become disciples of Jesus. And they were wandering back to temple worship. They were wandering back to the law. They were wandering back to the prophets. And the writer of the Hebrew letter wrote this to these people who were balking at the grace of God. They didn't want to listen to Jesus anymore. They wanted to go back to the law. They wanted to go back to the prophets. And this is what the Hebrew writer says as he opens his letter to these people who had changed their minds about Jesus and wanted to listen to someone and something else. Hebrews 1:1. Long ago, at many times, in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. Did you catch the message? See, Peter, James, and John were given the message. You've had Moses. You've had the prophets. Listen to Jesus. Well, these Hebrew followers of Jesus wanted to go back to the law. They wanted to go back to the prophets. So the writer of the letter says, may I remind you of something? Let me remind you of something as you're making your exit from being disciples of Jesus. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. This sets the premise for everything that's going to follow in this letter to these people who are turning away from following Christ. He's saying, in these last days, this last phase of everything, God has spoken to us through his Son. Listen to him. Did you ever put these two passages together before? You see, these people had been taught the teachings of the apostles. They had left the law. They had left the prophets. They were walking in the teachings of Jesus. They were listening to Jesus. But the call of the law and the prophets was pulling them back. Even though God said, we've been there, done that, don't do that anymore, listen to my Son, they wanted to go back. They wanted the law. They wanted the prophets. They didn't want Jesus anymore. They weren't listening. And they were leaving and walking away. I mean, we love to use a passage from here about assembling together. You know, in other words, if you don't show up to worship service on Sunday, you need to because Hebrews tells us so. It's much deeper than that, folks. These people had broken fellowship with the Son of God. They had broken covenant with the Son of God, and they wanted to go back to an old covenant that was null and void and dismiss the blood of Christ and the new covenant. So as we look back to the Mount of Transfiguration, God was telling his apostles, Peter, James, and John, these three men, the closest to Jesus, he's saying, these things are past now. And if you notice, let's go back there, back to Matthew 17. Verse 6, when the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, rise and have no fear. And when they lifted their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. Jesus only. Not King James only, Jesus only. They had seen Moses, they had seen Elijah, and they had seen Christ. But when they lift their eyes up one more time, they only see Jesus. Moses is gone. The law is gone. Elijah is gone. The prophet is gone. The only one standing before them is Jesus the Christ. The law and the prophets are gone. This is what's going to occur when Jesus is crucified. When he establishes his new covenant in his own blood, the law and the prophets are gone. The only one left standing is Jesus. And he stood on the third day, didn't he? We don't need to listen to the law. We don't need to listen to the prophets. We need to listen to Jesus. Do you notice the context was in these last days? In other words, this is it. This is the final phase. These are the last days. God's not going to speak to us through anyone else. This is why it was so important and significant to Paul and the other apostles when they were writing to the churches. Do not listen to false prophets. Do not listen to new prophecies. Do not turn back to the law. The law cannot and will not save you. Listen to Jesus. This was a major change. And God let the three of them know ahead of time. It's all going away. It's all going to be new. We're going into the last phase, the last days. But you notice Jesus said, don't you tell anybody about this until I've been resurrected from the dead. You hold on to this. You share it later. Why do you suppose he said that? If they said anything then about what they saw, it would make no sense to anybody, including them. But when they were to say it to their brothers and to all others in the context of the resurrected Christ, it makes absolute sense. And this is why the writer of the Hebrew letter employs what he does in the introduction of that letter. God spoke to you before, through the prophets, through the law. He speaks to you through Jesus. Listen to him. You read in that section in Hebrews, where is Jesus today? He's seated at the right hand of the Father on high. He is seated by the Father on his throne because he has fulfilled the law and the prophets. and he has taken his rightful place alongside his Father. Listen to him. These are the final days. This is the end of everything. It's all in Christ and no one else. No law, no prophet. Any of these prophets who came along later and said, God's got another message for you, they're liars. They're saying, listen to me rather than listen to the Son of God. When God himself proclaimed, listen to him and him alone. So there is no more prophet. There is no new law. It is the law of Christ. It is the will of the Father that we must walk in as we follow Christ. We need to listen to him. We don't need to listen to preachers, but I hope you are, if you know what I mean. We don't need to listen to rules and regulations that people make up. We need to listen to Jesus. These are the last days. And no, I'm not talking about because there's a war here, a war there, or any of that stuff that everybody wants to turn into the last days. We are in the last days of how things are. They're coming to an end. They're coming to a close. And there's only one that we need to listen to. One and one only. Jesus, the Son of God. Are we listening? Or are we letting all the other voices come in and tell us things we don't need to hear, certainly don't need to believe? Are we listening? And we sing that song, I'll be somewhere listening. Are we listening right now, right here, to the teachings and the life and the will of Christ? Are we listening? Are we? If we're not, we better be. Because this is it. God has spoken lastly through his Son. His words matter. His words carry weight. His words bring salvation. And his actions bring salvation. And his faith brings salvation. He is the Son of God. Listen to him. The lesson is yours this morning. If you need the prayers of the church or to put on Christ in baptism and begin to really listen to Jesus, I encourage you to come as we stand and sing.